The knife hovered above the pristine white frosting, catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the garden's canopy. James Peterson, the distinguished officiant, stood frozen, his weathered hands gripping the silver cake cutter. The wedding. Guests fell silent. Champagne glasses paused mid-toast. Eliza and Richard, still glowing in their matrimonial attire, exchanged confused glances as the man they'd trusted with their ceremony leaned toward the microphone. "I regret to inform you all," he announced, his voice carrying across the manicured lawn, "that what we've witnessed today is merely a performance." From his pocket, he produced a document bearing signatures familiar to the couple, yet with terms they'd never seen. Could a decades-old family agreement truly invalidate the vows exchanged just hours ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Earlier that morning, sunlight had streamed through the bay windows of the bridal suite as Eliza Morgan adjusted her pearl earrings, her mother's, worn on her own wedding day 42 years prior. The ivory gown, with its delicate lace overlay, had been altered to perfection, accentuating her slender frame while offering a nod to timeless elegance. "Something doesn't feel right," Eliza had murmured to her sister Rebecca, who dismissed it as typical pre-wedding nerves. Across the estate in the groom's quarters, Richard Harrington straightened his bow tie for the third time, his fingers working with uncharacteristic clumsiness. At 43, he had long abandoned the notion of marriage until Eliza had walked into his life 7 years ago. Their meeting at the university alumni gathering, he giving a guest lecture, she receiving an achievement award, had seemed serendipitous at the time. "You look like you're about to negotiate a merger, not get married," joked David, his best man and business partner of 15 years. Richard had forced a laugh. Maybe they're not so different. The ceremony had proceeded flawlessly. Judge Margaret Morgan, Eliza's mother, distinguished even in retirement, had beamed with approval from the front row. Thomas Harrington, Richard's father, had maintained his usual stoic expression, though a hint of satisfaction had played at the corners of his mouth. When James Peterson had pronounced them husband and wife, his voice had carried a strange weight. "By the power vested in me," he had announced, "and in accordance with all binding agreements, I now pronounce you married." Few had noticed the peculiar phrasing. The garden reception bloomed with roses and hydrangeas, crystal glasses catching the late afternoon sun. Champagne flowed as freely as the congratulations. "A perfect union," Margaret had remarked during her toast, her judicial voice commanding attention. "Two families, two legacies, joined as they were always meant to be." At the time, it had seemed a sentimental, if oddly formal, blessing. Thomas's speech had been briefer. "To contracts fulfilled and partnerships solidified," he had said, raising his glass. Richard had furrowed his brow momentarily, but brushed it off as his father's businesslike approach to everything, even his son's wedding. Then came the cake, a 5-tier masterpiece of fondant and buttercream, adorned with sugar flowers that mimicked the garden's blooms. The silver cake cutter, an Harrington family heirloom dating back 3 generations, gleamed in the sunlight as James handed it to the couple. "Before you cut," James had said, his voice suddenly sober, "there's a matter of significant importance." The document he produced bore the official seal of the state, with signatures that both Richard and Eliza recognized as their own. Yet there, in a clause neither recalled, were words that turned the joyous day cold. "The union shall be considered valid only upon final certification by James Peterson, executor of the original family agreement dated May 15, 1982. "What is this?" Richard demanded, the cake cutter still in his hand, his knuckles whitening around the ornate handle. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eliza's mother had not gasped with the others. Instead, her face had taken on the impassive expression her colleagues had once called her verdict face. Thomas Harrington had already reached for his phone, stepping away from the head table with urgent, hushed words into the receiver. "I suggest," James announced to the stunned gathering, "that the immediate family join me in the library. The rest of you, please continue to enjoy the celebration." His tone made it clear this was not a request, but a directive from someone accustomed to being obeyed. As they moved toward the house, Eliza clutched the wedding certificate with its mysterious claws, the paper trembling in her hand. The silver cake cutter remained embedded in the untouched wedding cake, marking the exact moment when their perfect day had begun to crumble. The estate's library, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and leather-bound volumes, had always been Richard's favorite room in his father's house. Now, as the heavy oak door closed behind them, it felt more like a courtroom than a sanctuary. "Explain yourself, James," Eliza demanded, her bridal bouquet abandoned, the delicate arrangement of white roses and baby's breath left behind on the cake table. "What is this document? And why are you doing this today of all days?" James settled into Thomas's high-backed chair, a presumption that didn't go unnoticed by the older Harrington, whose jaw tightened visibly. "The document is exactly what it appears to be. The official record of today's proceedings, including the clause that has been part of the arrangement from the beginning." "What arrangement?" Richard's voice was dangerously quiet. "I signed a standard marriage license, nothing more." Margaret Morgan moved to the sideboard, pouring herself a generous measure of scotch without asking permission. "Richard, Eliza, please sit down. This is complicated." "You're not surprised," Eliza observed, studying her mother's composed features. "You knew about this." Margaret sipped her drink. "Not about James's theatrics, no, but about the underlying agreement." "Yes." Thomas Harrington paced near the windows, glancing occasionally at his phone. "This was not how it was supposed to be handled." "We had an understanding, Peterson." "Did we?" James raised an eyebrow. "The understanding was that I would ensure all conditions were met before finalizing the union. I'm simply doing my duty." Rebecca, Eliza's sister, slipped into the room, carrying an old leather-bound photo album. "I found it where you said it would be, Mother," she said quietly, placing it on the desk. Eliza stared at her sister. "You're involved in this too." "Not involved," Rebecca clarified. "Informed. There's a difference." Richard snatched up the album, flipping it open to find family photographs, holidays, graduations, vacations, dating back decades. "What does this have to do with anything?" "Look closer at the university gala photos," James suggested. "Page 37. The page showed a younger Margaret and Thomas standing awkwardly together at what appeared to be a charity function. The date stamp indicated it was taken 25 years ago, long before Richard and Eliza had supposedly met for the first time. "You knew each other," Richard said, looking between his father and future mother-in-law. "Before our introduction." "The families have always known each other," Thomas stated flatly. "Business circles in this region are small." "Business circles," Eliza repeated, taking the album. She turned pages, finding more photographs where both families appeared, always maintaining a careful distance, yet undeniably connected. "This isn't coincidence." James extracted a folded document from his breast pocket. "Perhaps this will clarify matters. The original agreement, signed by both of your parents in 1982. The yellowed paper crackled as he unfolded it on the desk. Bold signatures at the bottom, Margaret Morgan, Thomas Harrington and James Peterson as witness, testified to its authenticity. "A business merger," Richard read aloud, his voice hollow. "Contingent upon future familial union." He looked up, disbelief etched across his features. "You arranged our marriage? Before we were even adults?" "We arranged a possibility," Margaret corrected. "The execution was left to chance and compatibility." "Chance?" Eliza's laugh was brittle. "Was it chance that Richard guest lectured at my award ceremony? Chance that we kept running into each other at alumni events?" The silence that followed was confirmation enough. 7 years, Richard said quietly. "Our entire relationship, was any of it real?" "All of it was real," Thomas insisted. "Your feelings, your connection, we didn't fabricate those." You just engineered every opportunity for them to develop, Rebecca murmured. Eliza sank into a chair, the weight of her wedding dress suddenly suffocating. I don't even know what's true anymore. The truth, James said, tapping the original agreement, is that according to this document, I have the final authority to certify your union. And until certain conditions are met, I cannot do so. What? Conditions? Richard demanded. James smiled thinly. That's what we're here to discuss. James extracted another document from his briefcase. Older, the edges frayed, the once white paper yellowed with age. Carefully, he spread it on the mahogany desk, smoothing the creases with practiced hands. The original pact, he announced, dated September 17th, 1982. The document bore the letterhead of a now-defunct law firm. Even at a glance, its legal language appeared dense, meticulous, and binding. I was 35, Margaret said softly, her fingers tracing the edge of her tumbler. Your father was 38, Richard. We were ambitious, perhaps reckless. Thomas Harrington stared out the window, his silhouette framed against the garden where guests still mingled, oblivious to the unfolding drama. The Morgan Harrington Investment Group was facing federal investigation. Our investors were threatening to pull out. What did you do? Eliza asked, her voice barely audible. Margaret's judicial composure cracked slightly. What we had to. The firm held retirement accounts for half the state's public employees. If it had collapsed... So you saved yourselves, Richard concluded coldly. We saved thousands of innocent people from financial ruin, Thomas corrected, turning from the window. And yes, ourselves in the process. James tapped the document. Judge Peterson, as I was then known, presided over the initial investigation. The evidence was troubling, but not entirely conclusive. Eliza's legal training kicked in. You were the judge, and now you're officiating our wedding? That's a conflict of... I recuse myself, James interrupted. Once the private arrangement was reached, another judge dismissed the case for lack of evidence. Because evidence disappeared, Rebecca added quietly from her corner. Richard leaned forward, scanning the document. This says the Morgan and Harrington families agreed to merge all business interests, with profits held in trust for future generations. His finger stopped at a particular clause. Specifically for the children of a union between the families. Us, Eliza whispered. This was all about creating a legal heir to inherit everything without raising suspicions about why the families merged their interests. It protected everyone, Margaret insisted. The investors, the public employees whose pensions were at stake. Don't pretend this was altruism, Richard snapped. You were saving yourselves from prosecution. Thomas's face hardened. You have no idea what was at stake. The scandal would have destroyed everything. Our reputations, our futures, your inheritance. Everything. So, instead, you orchestrated our entire lives. Eliza's voice rose. My college choice, my law school, even my specialization in corporate governance. Was that your influence too, Mother? Margaret's silence was answer enough. The alumni event, Richard said suddenly. 7 years ago, David convinced me to give that lecture at the last minute. He's been part of this all along, hasn't he? David has always looked out for your interests, Thomas replied carefully. No, for your interests, Richard corrected. James cleared his throat. The arrangement specified that the union must be voluntary and genuine. We could create opportunities for you to meet, but the relationship itself, that had to be real. How gracious of you, Eliza said bitterly, allowing us the illusion of choice. It wasn't an illusion, Margaret insisted. You could have walked away at any time, except you ensured we never would, Richard replied, by making sure we had everything in common, by steering us toward each other at every turn. The question now, James interjected, is whether the final condition of the agreement has been satisfied. Which is? Eliza demanded. James adjusted his glasses, reading directly from the document. The designated progeny of both bloodlines must enter into matrimony with full knowledge and acceptance of this agreement and its origins. Silence fell. Over the library, you needed us to know, Richard realized. The marriage isn't valid unless we accept that it was orchestrated from the beginning. That's why you did this publicly, Eliza added, to force our hand. James nodded once. The choice is yours. Accept the truth of your union's foundations and move forward as legal husband and wife, or reject it and walk away from each other and from your inheritance. Some choice, Richard muttered. Eliza stared at the document, at the signatures of the parents they had trusted. What happens if we refuse? David knocked softly before entering the library. His best man's boutonniere slightly wilted after hours of celebration. The guests are starting to ask questions, he said, his eyes quickly assessing the tension in the room. I've told them there's a minor paperwork issue being resolved. His gaze met Richard's, and he flinched at the coldness there. You knew, Richard stated rather than asked. Pieces, David admitted, closing the door behind him. Not everything. Rebecca moved to the center of the room, placing a slim leather portfolio on the desk. I found these in Mother's study last month, she said, avoiding Eliza's accusing stare. I was looking for the family trust documents for my children's college funds when I stumbled across them. She opened the portfolio to reveal 2 college admission letters, one addressed to Richard Harrington from Northwestern University's School of Business, dated 20 years prior, and one to Eliza Morgan from the same institution 3 years later. Our acceptance letters, Eliza said, reaching for hers. Why would you have Richard's mother? Margaret remained silent, studying the amber liquid in her glass. Because it wasn't coincidence, Rebecca explained gently. According to the notes I found with these, Thomas ensured Richard attended Northwestern because the Morgan family had connections there. 3 years later, those same connections helped secure Eliza's admission. I earned my place, Eliza protested. Yes, you did, Margaret finally spoke. Your grades and extracurriculars were exemplary. We just eliminated the competition. Richard examined his letter closely. The scholarship I received, the Westfield Foundation grant, that was you, wasn't it? Thomas nodded once. A subsidiary of one of our holdings. The money was always yours by right, just directed through proper channels. And my internship at Morgan Legal between law school semesters? Eliza asked, already knowing the answer. You were the most qualified applicant, Margaret insisted. Of the 3 you allowed to interview, Rebecca added quietly. Richard turned to David. The lecture, 7 years ago. You practically begged me to fill in for Professor Gladwell. David had the grace to look uncomfortable. I was told it was important that you attend, not why. And there I was, Eliza whispered, accepting the Alumni Achievement Award that I apparently earned fair and square, just with the playing field conveniently tilted in my direction. The memories surfaced with painful clarity. Richard at the podium discussing emerging markets, their eyes meeting across the university auditorium, the seemingly chance encounter at the reception afterward, the easy conversation that flowed between them despite having never met before. Our meet cute, she said bitterly, orchestrated down to the last detail. Not the last detail, Thomas objected. Nobody scripted what you would say to each other, how you would feel. Nobody forced you to exchange numbers, to call each other the next day, to fall in. Don't you dare say it, Richard interrupted. Don't you dare speak about our feelings when you manipulated every circumstance that brought them about. James cleared his throat. If I may, the pact required opportunity, not certainty. The genuine connection between you was fortunate. Fortunate, Eliza repeated hollowly. For whom? Rebecca hesitantly pulled another document from the portfolio, a business prospectus. There's more. Richard, your startup's initial funding. Around 5 years ago, Cornerstone Ventures as the lead investor? Richard stared at her. What about it? Cornerstone is a shell corporation, Rebecca explained, her accounting background evident in her precise terminology. It's controlled by a trust, which is in turn owned by the Morgan family, Eliza finished, looking at her mother in disbelief. You bankrolled his company without telling either of us? Margaret straightened her shoulders. It was a sound investment. Your firm has returned nearly 30% annually since its founding. That's not the point, Richard exploded. Everything I thought I built, you did build it, Thomas interrupted. The investment was just that, an investment. Nobody interfered with your business decisions, except ensuring its success was in service to this arrangement. Richard gestured to the pact on the desk. Eliza sank into a chair. How much of our lives is real? She whispered. How do we even begin to separate truth from manipulation? James Peterson reached for his briefcase again, extracting a polished wooden credential case. With deliberate movements, he opened it to reveal an assortment of official-looking documents, badges, and certificates. Perhaps I should clarify my position in all this, he said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that had once commanded courtrooms. I am not merely an officiant who can be replaced. He selected one document and placed it on the desk. My judicial appointment, dated 1978. I served on the federal bench for 14 years. Another document joined the first. My special appointment as executor of the Morgan-Harrington Agreement, co-signed by both your parents and notarized by the state. A third document completed the display. And finally, my current certification as marriage officiant, with specific authorization to oversee legally complex unions. Richard examined the documents with growing alarm. This is unprecedented. No judge has this kind of authority over a private marriage. No ordinary judge, perhaps, James agreed. But then, this is no ordinary marriage. Margaret approached the desk, her judicial instincts awakened. You overstepped, James. The agreement gave you oversight, not veto power. Did it? James raised an eyebrow, tapping the original pact. Section 7, paragraph 3. The appointed executor shall retain final authority to certify or invalidate any union intended to satisfy the terms herein. Thomas Harrington's business acumen kicked in. We can challenge this. The courts would never. The courts, James interrupted smoothly, would be forced to examine why such an unusual arrangement existed in the first place. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny, Thomas? Margaret. The threat hung in the air. Eliza, her legal mind, racing, studied the credentials more carefully. There's something not right about this. Your judicial career ended abruptly in 1992, right after the original investigation was dismissed. She looked up sharply. You didn't recuse yourself, did you? You were forced out. A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed James's composed features. A mutual agreement was reached regarding my tenure. You were compromised, Richard realized. That's why you're the executor. They had leverage over you. We all had leverage over each other, James corrected. A delicate balance that has maintained peace and prosperity for over 40 years. Eliza turned to her mother. You blackmailed a federal judge? Margaret's face remained impassive. We came to an understanding that made him the final authority over our lives, Richard said bitterly. James closed the credential case with a decisive snap. Your parents faced potential ruin. I faced potential disgrace. The agreement protected all parties while ensuring justice of a sort. Justice? Eliza laughed harshly. You call this justice? The investors were repaid. The pension funds were secured. No one lost their retirement, James stated flatly. Sometimes justice requires compromise. Richard stepped toward James, his patience visibly fraying. Cut through the philosophical nonsense. What exactly do you want from us today? Exactly. What the agreement stipulates, James replied calmly. Your informed consent to its terms. And if we refuse? Eliza demanded. James looked between them. Then, as the legal authority invested in me by both state and private contract, I must declare your marriage invalid and control of all assets. stemming from the Morgan-Harrington merger, would revert to a contingency trust, which you control, Richard guessed. Among others, James acknowledged. Thomas finally spoke up. There must be another way. The agreement is ironclad, James stated. I made certain of that. Did you? Eliza's eyes narrowed. Every contract has loopholes. By all means, James gestured expansively. You're welcome to try finding one, but know that I've safeguarded my position for 4 decades. Eliza and Richard exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them that no one had orchestrated. We need time, Eliza said firmly, and privacy. James checked his watch. Your guests won't wait forever. You have 1 hour, Margaret stepped forward. James, be reasonable. I've been reasonable for 40 years, he cut her off. 1 hour, then I announce my decision to your guests. As James moved toward the door, Richard called after him. Just one question, what do you personally gain from all this? James paused, hand on the doorknob. Insurance, Mr. Harrington, against a world where powerful people like your parents believe they can buy their way out of anything. A thin smile crossed his face. 1 hour. The door closed behind him with quiet finality. Outside in the garden, the wedding guests had moved from confusion to speculation. The string quartet valiantly continued playing Pachelbel, though the musicians exchanged uncertain glances as the wedding party's absence stretched beyond 30 minutes. Something's wrong, whispered Caroline, Eliza's roommate from law school, to her husband. Eliza would never leave her own reception for this long. At a nearby table, Richard's colleague Martin swirled his champagne thoughtfully. Did you notice how Judge Peterson paused during the vows? When he said, "By the power vested in me," there was something odd about his emphasis. And Thomas Harrington's toast, added Sophia, an executive at Richard's company. Who mentions contracts at their son's wedding? Between the rose-covered trellises, a folded note passed discreetly from hand to hand. Jennifer, Eliza's cousin, unfolded it carefully beneath the table. The families have history, she read in a whisper to the small group gathered around her. More than anyone knows. Who sent this? Asked a groomsman, glancing around suspiciously. Jennifer shrugged. It was passed to me, anonymous. At the bar, Edward Chen, a senior partner at Margaret Morgan's former law firm, ordered another scotch. I remember when those 2 families couldn't stand to be in the same room together, he remarked, to no one in particular. Something happened in the early 80s, never made the papers, but the legal community buzzed about it for months. The wedding. Planner Marianne desperately tried to maintain order. I'm sure they're just addressing a minor paperwork issue, she assured a concerned aunt. These things happen more often than you'd think. Paperwork doesn't make a mother of the bride look like she's facing a firing squad, the aunt replied, dryly. I've known Margaret for 30 years. That was her courtroom face. Near the gift table, Eliza's graduate school friend Diane leaned in conspiratorially. Did you know Richard and Eliza attended the same university? They always told everyone they met at that alumni event, but I swear I saw them together on campus, years before. Impossible, her husband replied. Their age difference, 3 years isn't that much, Diane insisted, and I'm certain it was them. The bartender, overhearing, added unexpectedly, the Morgans and Harringtons have been connected for decades. My father worked as household staff for the Harringtons in the 90s, said there were always hushed phone calls between the families, even when they pretended not to associate publicly. An elderly woman with a silver cane tapped it gently on the stone patio to gain attention from her seated companions. You young people think you've discovered something shocking, she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades. Some of us remember the original scandal. The investment firm, the missing funds, the sudden dismissal of charges. She smiled thinly. And then, miraculously, both families' fortunes not only recovered, but flourished together. What exactly happened, Mrs. Whitmore? Asked a younger guest eagerly. That's the question, isn't it? Mrs. Whitmore replied. All I know is that James Peterson was the presiding judge. And shortly after the case disappeared, so did his judicial career. The wedding coordinator's assistant approached with a tray of fresh champagne flutes. "Please, everyone enjoy the refreshments. The family will rejoin us shortly." Her professional smile didn't reach her worried eyes. 2 tables away, Richard's Uncle Henry snorted. "I warned Thomas against this union years ago. Some agreements should stay buried." His wife elbowed him sharply. "Not here, Henry." But the damage was done. Nearby guests exchanged glances, piecing together fragments of overheard conversations. A cousin who had traveled from Chicago checked his watch. "Almost 40 minutes now. Should someone check on them?" "Look," someone pointed toward the house. "David's heading back to the library." All eyes followed the best man's hurried figure as he disappeared into the mansion. The wedding planner intercepted a waiter. "Don't serve the cake yet," she instructed quietly, "and find out if the photographer can stay an extra hour. Something tells me we're going to need it." The string quartet finally exhausted their repertoire and paused, leaving an uncomfortable silence that amplified the murmurs sweeping through the garden. As if on cue, the folded note made another appearance, passed to a different table. The recipient, a distant Harrington relative, read it and frowned. "What does it say?" her companion asked. "It says, 'Ask about the real agreement of 1982. Nothing today is what it seems.'" Back in the library, Richard held the contested marriage certificate under the desk lamp, scrutinizing his signature with growing suspicion. Something felt off. The pressure points, the slight upward tilt of the final N in Harrington. "This isn't right," he muttered. "Look at this, Eliza." Eliza leaned over, her trained legal eye catching the discrepancies immediately. "The baseline is too even. You always write with a slight downward angle." She looked up sharply. "I don't think you signed this." Rebecca, who had remained in the room while their parents and David stepped out to manage the guests, moved closer. "Let me see. I specialized in forensic accounting, remember?" From her clutch, she produced a small folding kit containing a magnifying glass, a ruler, and several fine-tipped markers, tools of her trade that she carried habitually. "Handwriting analysis basics," she explained, opening the kit. "I use this when reviewing potentially fraudulent financial documents." She examined both the contested document and Richard's driver's license signature with methodical precision. "The letter formations are similar but not identical. Look at the R. The loop is too rounded on this document, and the pressure points are wrong." "Forged," Eliza concluded. "Professionally," Rebecca confirmed. "Good enough to pass casual inspection, but it wouldn't stand up to expert analysis." Richard turned to Thomas, who had just returned to the library. "Did you know about this?" Thomas appeared genuinely startled. "What are you talking about?" "The signatures," Eliza explained, pointing to the document. "They're forgeries." Thomas took the paper, his business-trained eye narrowing as he examined it. "This isn't... I never authorized this." Margaret entered, closing the door behind her. "What's happening?" "Someone forged our signatures on the marriage certificate," Richard explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. "The question is who?" The door opened again, admitting James Peterson. "Your hour isn't up," he began, but stopped short at the tension in the room. "Did you forge these signatures?" Eliza demanded, holding up the document. Something flickered in James's eyes, surprise quickly masked. "That's absurd. I'm an officer of the court." "Former officer," Richard corrected. "And you haven't answered the question." James approached slowly, taking the document with visible reluctance. He examined it briefly before setting it down. "If there are irregularities, they're news to me as well." "Convenient," Richard scoffed. Rebecca spoke up, her quiet voice cutting through the tension. "The forgery is recent. The ink hasn't fully cured. See how it still has that slight gloss under direct light? This was done within the last week." "I need to make a call," Thomas said abruptly, pulling out his phone and stepping toward the window. Margaret exchanged a look with Eliza that contained volumes, concern, confusion, and the first hint of uncertainty. "This," changes things," she said carefully. "Does it?" James asked, regaining his composure. "The original agreement still stands, regardless of how this particular document came to be." "It calls your credibility into question," Eliza countered. Lawyer to former judge. "If you're willing to present forged documents, what else might you have falsified?" James stiffened. "I did not forge these signatures." "Then who did?" Richard demanded. The question hung in the air as Thomas returned from his call, his expression grim. "Mercer says he prepared the standard certificate as instructed. He has no knowledge of this version." "Mercer?" Eliza asked. "My attorney," Thomas clarified. "He handled all the paperwork for today." All eyes turned to James, whose composure showed its first crack. "This is unexpected." "Is it?" Richard pressed. Margaret's judicial instincts had fully awakened. "James, if you're being manipulated as well, now would be the time to tell us." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across James's face. "The original agreement is still binding," he insisted, but with less conviction. "Not if it's been tampered with," Eliza pointed out, "and not if you can't prove you have the authority you claim." Rebecca carefully photographed the document with her phone. "I know an expert who can analyze this immediately. Former FBI specializes in document fraud." James reached for the document, but Richard intercepted his hand. "I don't think so. This stays with us now." "You're making a mistake," James warned. "No," Eliza said quietly. "I think we're finally finding the truth." The tension in the library was interrupted by a gentle knock. The door opened to reveal Grace Harrington, Thomas's wife of 45 years, her elegant silver hair still perfectly styled despite the afternoon's events. "Thomas," she said quietly, "this has gone far enough." All eyes turned to the petite woman who had until now remained with the guests, playing the gracious mother of the groom. "Grace, this isn't the time," Thomas began, but she cut him off with a raised hand. "It's exactly the time." She turned to Richard. "There's a safe in your father's study. Behind the Monet reproduction, it's not actually a reproduction by the way." Another little secret. Her smile was sad but determined. "The combination is your birthday, followed by mine." "Grace," Thomas protested, "those documents are overdue for sunlight," she finished firmly. "I've kept silent for 40 years, Thomas. No more." Richard looked between his parents, bewilderment giving way to resolution. "Michael," he called to his younger brother, who had been standing near the doorway. "You know where Dad's study is?" Michael nodded and slipped out of the room. Grace moved to stand beside Eliza. "I fought against this arrangement from the beginning," she said softly, "but I was outvoted and eventually silenced. I'm sorry." James stepped forward. "Mrs. Harrington, you're interfering with a legally binding—" "Oh, save it, James," Grace interrupted with unexpected steel. "Your legal posturing lost its intimidation factor decades ago." The room fell silent, stunned by this new side of the normally reserved Grace Harrington. 20 minutes later, Michael returned carrying a weathered leather portfolio. The safe was where Mom said, "I found this inside." Thomas moved as if to intercept, but a quelling look from Grace stopped him. Richard accepted the portfolio and laid it on the desk, opening it carefully. Inside were dozens of letters, legal documents, and photographs, meticulously organized and preserved. Richard extracted the first letter, dated June 1982, addressed, "From Thomas Harrington to Margaret Morgan." "Margaret," he read aloud, "we must proceed carefully. If the SEC investigation connects the diverted funds to either of us—" He looked up sharply. "Diverted funds," Margaret's judicial composure finally cracked. "It wasn't how it sounds." Eliza pulled out another document, a bank statement showing transfers of millions into offshore accounts. "It sounds like embezzlement, Mother." Richard continued examining the documents, his expression darkening. "There's a memo here about falsifying investment returns." He shook his head in disbelief. "You were running a Ponzi scheme." "A temporary liquidity solution," Thomas corrected stiffly. "That's what Bernie Madoff called it too." Rebecca observed dryly. Eliza found a newspaper clipping showing a younger Margaret and Thomas at a charity gala. In the background, barely noticeable but unmistakable, the two of them in what appeared to be an intimate conversation. "You were involved," she said slowly, looking at her mother. "Romantically." Margaret didn't deny it. "Briefly, before the investigation." Grace's smile was brittle. "Not so briefly. Richard uncovered a legal brief with James Peterson's name as presiding judge. The case was building against you both. Serious charges. Then suddenly he flipped to another document, dismissed with prejudice. We made it right, Thomas insisted. Every investor was repaid. After James buried the evidence, Richard concluded, James remained stiffly formal. "I made a judicial determination based on blackmail," Grace interrupted. "They had evidence you accepted bribes in a previous case." James's face drained of color. "That's not—" "It's all here," Richard said, holding up a sealed envelope with Peterson evidence written across it. "Insurance, as you'd call it." Eliza pieced it together. "So the agreement was mutual blackmail. You all had evidence against each other." "And the marriage?" Richard asked, voice dangerously quiet. "Where does that fit?" Margaret finally spoke. "The merger of families was to ensure no one would ever speak out. Our interests would be permanently aligned." "Through us," Eliza whispered. "Your children." "We needed an unbreakable bond," Thomas admitted. "Something that would outlast our careers, our lives even." "A dynasty built on fraud," Richard said bitterly, "with James as the eternal watchdog. The ultimate insurance policy," Eliza added, looking at her mother with new eyes. "Does Dad know about you and Thomas?" Margaret's silence was answer enough. Richard discovered a yellowed newspaper clipping at the bottom of the portfolio. The headline, partially faded but still legible, read, "Federal investigation into Morgan Harrington Investment Group discontinued." The date, October 17th, 1982, 1 month after the pact was signed. He smoothed the brittle paper on the desk. "Let's hear the full story. No more half-truths." Thomas sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 78 years. "It was 1981. The recession hit our investment firm hard. We had thousands of clients, regular people with pensions, retirement, accounts. The market crashed," Margaret continued, her voice distant with memory. "We should have reported the losses, but that would have meant the end of the firm. So instead, you lied," Eliza said flatly. "We protected our clients," Thomas insisted. "We used capital from new investors to cover existing obligations while we recovered." "Classic Ponzi scheme," Rebecca murmured. "We had every intention of making it right," Margaret said defensively. "And we did, eventually." Richard scanned the article. "It says here that sources close to the investigation cited insufficient evidence of wrongdoing. But that wasn't true, was it?" Grace spoke up from her position by the window. "James made the evidence disappear." All eyes turned to the former judge, who remained rigidly upright, his composure cracking under scrutiny. "It wasn't that simple," James said, his authoritative voice diminished. "There were considerations, such as the evidence they had against you," Richard interrupted. "The Westfield bribery case." James flinched visibly. "How did you—" "It's all here," Richard tapped the portfolio. "My father documented everything, insurance, as you said." Michael, who had remained silent, stepped forward. "The article mentions minimal investor impact, but there's a list here of over 200 people who lost significant sums." "They were all eventually repaid," Thomas said quickly, "with interest." "After how long?" Eliza demanded. Margaret and Thomas exchanged glances. 10 years, Margaret admitted. "The agreement gave us time to recover legitimately and make restitution. Meanwhile, James quietly resigned from the bench," Richard noted, finding another clipping announcing Peterson's retirement to pursue private practice. "It was mutually beneficial," James said stiffly. "And where does our marriage fit into this sordid arrangement?" Eliza asked, her voice sharp with betrayal. Thomas looked to Margaret, who nodded slightly before explaining. The agreement had a 20-year timeline for restitution and rehabilitation, but we needed something more permanent to ensure everyone's continued cooperation. A blood pact, Richard said with disgust. A merger of families, Thomas corrected. If our children were united, our interests would remain permanently aligned. No one would risk exposure. And the final clause requiring our informed consent? Eliza asked. James cleared his throat. A legal necessity. The arrangement couldn't bind the next generation without their knowledge and acceptance. How magnanimous, Richard said bitterly. Rebecca, who had been examining the documents methodically, looked up. There's something else here. A list of subsidiaries that emerged from the original firm after restructuring. She laid out several papers. Look familiar, Richard? Richard scanned the corporate names, his face paling. Riverstone Capital, Atlas Partners, Meridian Trust. He looked up in shock. These are my biggest clients. Of course they are, Grace said softly. Why do you think they hired your firm specifically? My entire client base. It's all connected to this. Richard's voice rose incredulously. Your success was never in question. Thomas tried to reassure him. Your work is exemplary. We just ensured you had the opportunity to prove it. And my judicial clerkship? Eliza turned to her mother. My partnership track. Margaret had the grace to look uncomfortable. We opened doors. You walked through them on your own merit. The wedding was the final piece, James added. With you. Two married, the circle would be complete. The past permanently sealed. Richard looked at Eliza, saw his own sense of betrayal mirrored in her eyes. They built our entire lives on a foundation of fraud and expected us to continue the deception, Eliza added quietly. For the next generation, for protection, Thomas insisted, for family. This isn't family, Richard replied coldly. This is conspiracy. The revelations hung heavy in the library air. Eliza checked her watch. Nearly 90 minutes had passed. Since they'd left their reception, outside their guests would be wondering, speculating. Inside, the foundations of their relationship lay exposed and questioned. She turned to Richard. We need to talk, alone. Richard nodded. Everyone out, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. This is between Eliza and me now. After reluctant departures and one final protest from James about the ticking clock, the couple found themselves alone among the scattered evidence of decades of manipulation. I don't even know where to begin, Richard said, loosening his bow tie in a gesture of exhaustion. Eliza moved to a bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines until she found what she was looking for, a worn copy of The Great Gatsby. She pulled it down and opened it to reveal a hollowed interior containing a small wooden box. How did you know that was there? Richard asked, surprised. I didn't, she admitted. But you mentioned once that your father kept your grandfather's first edition Fitzgerald collection in the library. It was a guess. Inside the box were dozens of folded notes and small mementos. Eliza recognized them immediately. Our letters. You kept them? Richard asked softly. Of course I did. She carefully unfolded one, dated 6 years earlier. Remember this? You were in Hong Kong for that conference, and the time difference meant we could only exchange emails. Richard took the letter, a smile forming despite everything. I wrote this on hotel stationery at 3 a.m. because I couldn't sleep without talking to you. The negotiations are tedious, Eliza read from another, but I keep thinking about that weekend at the lake house. How is it possible to miss someone this much after only 3 days apart? Richard found another letter. Your note before my first major client presentation. Remember to breathe, stand tall, and know that whatever happens, I believe in you more than anyone else ever could. Did they orchestrate that too? Eliza wondered aloud. Did they somehow make me write those exact words? Richard shook his head. They may have engineered our meeting, but they couldn't script this. He gestured to the collection of notes and tokens. They couldn't force this. Eliza pulled out a pressed wildflower from between 2 notes. From our hike in Colorado, you said it matched my eyes. No parent or contract made me notice that, Richard said quietly. They continued through the collection: movie ticket stubs, a cork from their anniversary champagne, a sketch Eliza had drawn of Richard sleeping on a Sunday morning. Notes passed during boring dinner parties, inside jokes that no one else would understand. 7 years, Eliza murmured. Was any of it real? All of it, Richard answered without hesitation. The beginning may have been manipulated, but what came after that was us, just us. Eliza found a small velvet pouch and emptied it into her palm. Out tumbled her original engagement ring, a simple band with a modest diamond that she'd worn before Richard had surprised her with the larger family heirloom for their wedding. You bought this before you even spoke to your father about proposing, she remembered. 3 months' salary, just like the old saying. Because I wanted to do it on my own terms, Richard confirmed. No family money, no connections. Just me, asking the woman I love to share my life. Eliza slipped the simple ring onto her finger beside her wedding band. This one was always my favorite. Richard took her hands in his. They may have orchestrated the circumstances of our meeting, but they didn't create what we built. The connection, the trust, the thousands of small moments. Those are ours. But can we move forward knowing how it began? Eliza asked, the lawyer in her needing to examine all angles. Knowing our entire relationship was part of a plan to cover up their crimes. Richard's reply was interrupted by a firm knock at the door. Without waiting for a response, James Peterson entered, his composure regained. Your time is up, he announced. The guests are beginning to leave. I need your decision now. Eliza and Richard exchanged a look, not of confusion or betrayal now, but of growing determination and unity. Actually, James, Eliza said, rising to her feet, we have some questions about those forged signatures. Richard stood beside her, their shoulders touching, and about exactly what you've been getting out of this arrangement for 40 years. David slipped back into the library, closing the door behind him quietly. I saw Peterson making a call. Near the garden pavilion, he said in a low voice. He seemed agitated, kept looking over his shoulder. Did you hear anything? Richard asked his friend, newfound suspicion tempering his usual trust. Just fragments. Something about contingencies and alternate arrangements, David replied. I think he's preparing for you two to refuse his terms. Eliza's legal instincts sharpened. He's been too confident throughout this confrontation. There's something we're still missing. Rebecca entered with her tablet. I've been doing some digging into Peterson's background, she said, swiping through screens of information. His judicial career ended under unusual circumstances, but the official records are sparse. What about unofficial records? Richard asked. Social media has its uses. Rebecca smiled slightly. I found his former clerk on LinkedIn. We've been messaging. Richard raised an eyebrow. And? Peterson was forced to resign after evidence emerged of him accepting bribes in a corporate case, unrelated to our parents. The evidence was suppressed as part of a deal with the Judicial Review Board. No charges, no public scandal, but he had to leave the bench. So our parents weren't the only ones with leverage over him, Eliza noted. There's more, Rebecca continued. After leaving the judiciary, he established a consulting firm specializing in complex legal arrangements for high-net-worth families. A professional blackmailer, Richard muttered. A very wealthy one, Rebecca corrected. His firm has received substantial consulting fees from both the Morgan and Harrington family trusts every year since 1992. The implications sank in. He's been profiting from this arrangement for decades. Eliza realized. Michael returned carrying a leather briefcase. Found this in Peterson's car. The door was unlocked. You broke into his car? Eliza asked, alarmed. Technically, I just opened an unlocked door. Michael shrugged. Besides, I think you'll want to see what's inside. The briefcase contained legal files, a calendar, and a worn leather journal. Richard opened the journal carefully, scanning the neat handwriting. It's encoded, he said with disappointment. Names are just initials, and there are numbers that don't make sense. Eliza looked over his shoulder. Not encoded, abbreviated. These are standard legal notations, and the numbers, she flipped through several pages. They're payment records. She pointed to entries marked M.H. Trust, followed by substantial figures. He's been tracking the payments from both families. Richard continued through the journal, stopping abruptly at a recent entry. Look at this, dated 3 weeks ago. Wedding contingency activated. Contracts prepared for all scenarios. A.D. Was planning this disruption all along, Eliza said. But why now? The arrangement has worked for him for decades. David, who had been examining the calendar, spoke up. There's a meeting scheduled for next week with the SEC. The Securities and Exchange Commission? Richard's head snapped up. Why would he? Because the statute of limitations on financial fraud is about to expire, Eliza realized, her legal mind connecting the dots. The original crime happened 40 years ago. Once the statute runs out, much of their leverage over each other disappears. Richard flipped to the journal's most recent entries. Here it is. Final extraction before closure. He's planning one. Last big payout. The ultimate insurance policy, David murmured. Eliza examined other documents from the briefcase. He's prepared multiple versions of our marriage certificate, some valid, some with conditions, some completely invalidated. So he could produce whichever one served him best, Richard concluded. Rebecca, still scrolling through her research, gasped softly. I found his banking records. There's a transfer from 2 days ago, $5 million from an offshore account to his personal holdings. A payment for what? Richard wondered. Or from whom? Eliza countered. The door opened and James Peterson entered, stopping short at the sight of his open briefcase and journal on the desk. His composure cracked completely. That's private property, he snapped, reaching for the journal. Richard moved it beyond his reach. Not anymore. We know about the payments, James, the meeting with the SEC, the multiple versions of our marriage certificate, your decades of extortion, Eliza added, from both our families. Consulting fees, James corrected automatically, his eyes darting between them and the exposed evidence. And the recent $5 million? Rebecca asked. Was that a consulting fee too? For the first time, James looked genuinely cornered. You don't understand the complexities. I think we're beginning to, Richard interrupted. You've been playing both sides for 40 years. The question is, Eliza said quietly, who paid you $5 million 2 days before our wedding? And what exactly did they buy? James Peterson's carefully maintained facade crumbled visibly. He straightened his tie in a reflexive gesture, eyes darting between the exposed journal and the door. I want my property returned immediately, he demanded, voice strained. Those are privileged documents. Privileged? Eliza echoed incredulously. These are records of extortion. Richard had been scrolling through his phone. David, get my father and Margaret in here, now. As David left, Michael quietly placed a small black device on the desk, a digital voice recorder with a blinking red light. Insurance, he explained with a slight smile. I thought we might need our own. James lunged for the recorder, but Richard blocked him easily. Not so fast. I think we all need to hear what you have to say, on the record this time. Thomas and Margaret entered, tension evident in their rigid postures. They surveyed the scene, the open briefcase, the journal, the recorder, and exchanged alarmed glances. What's happening? Thomas demanded. Richard gestured to the evidence spread across the desk. James has been playing us all. The arrangement wasn't just about keeping your secrets. It was his personal cash cow. You've been paying him, Eliza told her mother accusingly. For decades, both of you have. Margaret's judicial composure wavered. It was the arrangement. He held evidence that could have destroyed us. And you held evidence about his judicial Misconduct, Richard countered. Mutually assured destruction, remember. So why the payments? Thomas's business acumen surfaced through his shock. The payments weren't in the original agreement. All eyes turned to James, who had retreated to the far side of the desk, looking increasingly cornered. A necessary adjustment, he said stiffly. For ongoing risk management. Blackmail, Richard translated flatly. And now, Eliza continued, with the statute of limitations about to expire on the original financial crimes, you needed one last big score. James remained silent, his expression calculating. $5 million, Rebecca said, consulting her tablet. Transferred to your Cayman account 2 days ago. Who paid you, James? The former judge glanced between Thomas and Margaret. A vinyl consultation fee. From whom? Thomas demanded. I authorized no such payment. Nor did I, Margaret added firmly. Richard leaned forward, pressing his advantage. Someone paid you to disrupt our wedding, specifically. Someone with $5 million to spend and a stake in keeping our families apart. Clarence Whitfield, Michael suggested suddenly. Everyone turned to him. Dad's chief rival. He's been trying to take over the Harrington holdings for years. Thomas's face darkened with fury. Whitfield? You're working for Whitfield? James's silence was damning. Eliza picked up the thread. The statute expiring meant your leverage was disappearing. So you found a new patron, someone who benefits if our families remain divided. And what was the plan? Richard pressed. Invalidate our marriage, trigger a family rift, watch as decades of careful arrangements collapse, and then... What? Whitfield swoops in to pick up the pieces of the Harrington empire while it's vulnerable, while collecting your final payment from our parents, Eliza added, double-dipping to the very end. James straightened, attempting to reclaim his dignity. You have no proof of any of this. Michael tapped the recorder. We do now. Rebecca held up her tablet. And I've just forwarded records of the offshore transfer to both of your attorneys. James's composure finally shattered completely. You don't understand what it's been like. 40 years of managing your family's mess. I deserved compensation. For burying evidence? For extortion? Eliza asked incredulously. For keeping the peace, James shouted. Without me, both your families would have destroyed each other decades ago. So you appointed yourself what? Guardian? Mediator? Extortionist? Richard's voice was cold with contempt. I protected you all, James insisted. When the statute expires next month, what leverage would I have left? I needed security. At the expense of our marriage, Eliza said. James's laugh was bitter. Your marriage was always a transaction. I simply renegotiated the terms. Thomas stepped forward, businesslike even in crisis. What exactly did you promise Whitfield? Access, James admitted, the fight leaving him. To the trust documents, to the merger paperwork. Enough to challenge the legitimacy of the combined assets. The recorder captured every damning word as Margaret sank into a chair, the full implications becoming clear. You would have undone 40 years of careful work, she whispered. Everything we built. Everything you stole, James corrected. Bitterly, let's not pretend any of us are innocent here. Eliza reached for her bridal clutch, extracting a sleek silver pen and her personal notepad. Years of legal training took over as she began drafting on the library's antique desk, her handwriting swift and precise. What are you doing? James asked, eyeing her suspiciously. What I do best, she replied without looking up, drafting a legally binding agreement. Richard moved beside her, reading over her shoulder. His business acumen complemented her legal expertise, as he suggested. Adjustments. Add a clause about financial disclosure, he murmured, and specific penalties for breach. While they worked, Rebecca continued her digital investigation. I've mapped James's financial network, she announced. He has approximately $23 million spread across 7 offshore accounts, all traceable to payments from our families and similar arrangements with 3 other wealthy clients. Quite the enterprise you've built, Thomas remarked coldly to James. James remained defiant. none of which is illegal. Consulting fees are perfectly legitimate. Extortion isn't, Margaret countered, her judicial knowledge resurfacing. Nor is conspiracy to commit fraud, which is exactly what your arrangement with Whitfield constitutes. Michael, who had been examining the calendar from James's briefcase, spoke up. There's a meeting scheduled with Whitfield tomorrow morning. Location is just listed as usual place. The St. Regis, Thomas said immediately. Clarence always conducts sensitive business in their private dining room. Old habits. Eliza finished her draft with a flourish and slid it across to James. Here's what's going to happen. I'm not signing anything, James scoffed. You misunderstand. Richard said, his voice calm but unyielding. This isn't a negotiation. Eliza tapped the document. You have 3 options. 1. We take everything we've discovered to the authorities. The statute may be expiring on the original financial crimes, but blackmail, extortion, and your current conspiracy with Whitfield are all well within prosecution timeframes. 2, Richard continued, we contact the Judicial Review Board with evidence of your ongoing misconduct since leaving the bench. Your practice, your reputation, your freedom, all gone. Or 3, Eliza concluded, you sign this agreement which guarantees your silence and cooperation in exchange for certain considerations. James picked up the document warily. What considerations? You get to walk away, Richard stated flatly. No prosecution, no exposure. You keep what you've already extracted from our families, but surrender all claims to future payments. And return the $5 million from Whitfield, Rebecca added. James's laugh was hollow. You expect me to return $5 million? Voluntarily? Consider the alternative, Eliza suggested. Federal charges carry significant prison terms at your age. The agreement also requires you to provide a sworn statement regarding your arrangement with Whitfield, Richard added, which we'll use if he attempts any corporate maneuvers against either family. James studied the document more carefully, his legal training evident in his methodical review. And my certification of your marriage? You'll execute a valid, unconditional certificate immediately, Eliza said. No hidden clauses, no future leverage. Why would I agree to this? James demanded. I still hold evidence against your parents. Evidence of 40-year-old crimes that will soon be beyond prosecution, Richard reminded him, while our evidence against you is current and actionable. Margaret stepped forward. James, it's over. Take the offer. Thomas nodded in agreement. You've extracted enough from our families over the decades. Consider this your retirement package. James's eyes darted between them, calculating his dwindling options. I want immunity in writing, from all of you. It's in paragraph 6, Eliza pointed out. Full mutual releases of all claims. And if I refuse? Michael held up the still recording device. Then I make a call to the FBI field office where my college roommate works as a financial crimes specialist. Silence fell as James weighed his options, decades of careful manipulation crumbling around him. You've been playing chess while thinking we were merely pawns, Richard observed. But it turns out we know how to play too. James's hand trembled slightly as he reached for Eliza's silver pen. I taught you too well, he muttered as he signed the document. No, Eliza corrected him. Our parents taught us too well. The only difference is we're using those lessons to build something honest. As James's signature dried on the page, Richard turned to their parents. We're not finished. You're next. Margaret Morgan removed her judicial signet ring, a heavy gold band bearing the scales of justice that she'd worn since her appointment to the bench 30 years prior. She placed it deliberately on the desk beside Eliza's drafted agreement. I've made mistakes, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. Choices that began with good intentions and spiraled into something I scarcely recognize. Thomas watched her with a complex expression, decades of shared secrets reflected in his gaze. After a moment's hesitation, he removed his own signet ring, the Harrington family crest gleaming in the library's warm light. "The merger was meant to protect our clients," he added. "Then our families. Then ourselves." He placed his ring beside Margaret's. "Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of the difference," James scoffed from his corner. "How touching. A sudden attack of conscience after 40 years. "Be quiet," Grace Harrington said sharply, speaking for the first time since. The confrontation began. "You've done enough damage." Richard looked between the rings, symbols of the power and authority that had shaped his life from afar. "This doesn't erase what you've done." "No," Margaret agreed. "Nothing could, but perhaps it can begin something new." Eliza studied her mother carefully. "What are you suggesting?" "An alliance," Margaret explained. "Not one built on secrets and manipulation, but on transparency and restitution." Thomas nodded. "We've spent decades ensuring no one discovered the original financial improprieties. Perhaps it's time we focused instead on making genuine amends." "How?" Richard demanded skeptically. "The statute of limitations expires on criminal prosecution," Margaret finished. "Not on civil liability, not on moral obligation." Eliza's legal mind engaged immediately. "You're talking about a voluntary restitution fund for the original investors and a restructuring of both family enterprises," Thomas added, "with new leadership." His gaze shifted meaningfully to Richard and Eliza. James laughed bitterly. "You're offering them control of the empire to buy their silence." "How is that different from what I've been doing?" "Because we're not asking for their silence," Margaret said firmly. "We're asking for their help in making things right." Grace stepped forward, picking up both rings. "These symbols have meant many things over the years: power, prestige, duty." She held them out to Richard and Eliza. "Perhaps they can now represent reconciliation and renewal." Eliza hesitated. "This feels like another manipulation." "It is," Thomas acknowledged bluntly. "We're trying to salvage what we can, our relationship with our children, the future of our families. But the choice is genuinely yours." Margaret took a deep breath. "James is right about one thing. We've been living with this arrangement for so long, we don't know how to exist without it. But we'd like to try." Rebecca, who had been analyzing the financial data, looked up from her tablet. "For what it's worth, I've run the numbers. A restitution fund is financially feasible, even with generous interest applied to the original losses." "And Whitfield?" Richard asked his father. "He'll still be coming after the company." "Let him try," Thomas said with unexpected fire. "With both families united legitimately, he doesn't stand a chance." "If we do this," Eliza said carefully, "it would be on our terms. Complete transparency, no more secrets." Margaret nodded. "Agreed. And you both face the original investors," Richard added. "Personally, no hiding behind lawyers or corporate structures." Thomas swallowed hard but nodded. "If that's what it takes." Eliza and Richard exchanged a long look, years of shared understanding passing between them. After a moment, Richard reached for Grace's outstretched hand and took his father's signet ring. "Not as a continuation," he clarified, "but as a new beginning." Eliza followed suit, accepting her mother's judicial ring. For restitution, not power, James watched this unexpected alliance form with undisguised bitterness. How convenient. The dynasty continues under new management. "No," Eliza corrected him. "The dynasty ends. What comes next will be built on different foundations." Margaret and Thomas moved to stand beside their children, presenting a united front for perhaps the first time, without hidden agendas. "The guests have waited long enough," Grace reminded them gently, "and there's still a wedding to salvage." "First," Richard said firmly, "we need to find the real marriage certificate." David burst into the library, slightly out of breath. "I found something," he announced, holding up a leather portfolio. "In Peterson's car, a different compartment than where Michael found the briefcase." "More unauthorized searches," James protested wearily. "Is there no respect for privacy left?" Not for blackmailers, David replied without remorse, opening the portfolio on the desk. Inside was an assortment of documents, including what appeared to be the original marriage certificate. Clean, unmarked by suspicious clauses, bearing signatures. That even at a glance looked authentic. The real certificate, Eliza breathed, examining it carefully. Executed this morning during the ceremony. Rebecca compared the signatures with known samples. These match perfectly, no signs of forgery. So James switched documents, Richard concluded. The legitimate certificate for the modified version just before the reception. Michael, who had been quiet for some time, spoke up. The cake cutting, you handed the knife to Richard, then distracted everyone by adjusting the microphone. That's when you made the switch. James didn't bother denying. It a simple sleight of hand. Decades as a judge taught me that presentation is everything. So our marriage is valid, Eliza said, relief evident in her voice. It always was. Legally, yes, Margaret confirmed, her judicial expertise surfacing. The certificate was properly executed during the ceremony. The switch afterward was merely theatre. I needed leverage, James explained unapologetically. The forged version was meant to force your compliance. Thomas examined the document. It bears my attorney's notarization. It's legitimate. Richard turned to Eliza, taking her hand. So technically we've been married this entire time. We've been arguing in the library. Some honeymoon? She replied with the first genuine smile since the crisis began. A wedding coordinator knocked tentatively before entering. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but the guests, many have started to leave. The caterers are asking about dinner service and the band needs to know if they should continue. The reality of their abandoned reception crashed back upon them. 2 hours had passed since the cake-cutting debacle. Tell them we'll be out shortly, Grace instructed, taking charge with practiced ease. Begin dinner service and inform the band to prepare for the first dance. As the coordinator departed, relieved to have direction, Eliza addressed the certificate issue. We need this documented properly. No room for future manipulation. Rebecca was already on it. I've photographed the authentic certificate and sent encrypted copies to both your personal and work emails, as well as to your attorneys. And I've made backup recordings of this entire confrontation, Michael added, holding up his phone, just in case someone's memory becomes selective later. David gathered the authentic documents into a secure folder. I'll ensure these are filed. With the county clerk's office first thing Monday morning. James watched these precautions with resignation. You've thought of everything. We learned from experts, Richard replied pointedly. Eliza turned to her mother and Thomas. We should return to the reception, but this conversation isn't over. We know, Margaret acknowledged. There's much more to resolve. But perhaps, Thomas suggested carefully, we could set it aside just for tonight, let you have your wedding day. Richard considered this. On one condition, tomorrow morning, all of us meet to begin making this right. The restitution fund, the restructuring, all of it. Agreed, both parents said simultaneously. James stood. And what about me? You'll stay right where we can see you, Richard instructed, at least until we've announced to our guests that our marriage is valid. And then? James asked. And then, you'll honor the agreement you just signed, Eliza said firmly. Starting with returning to the reception to properly certify our marriage. No conditions, no clauses, no manipulations. James nodded reluctantly. Grace straightened Richard's bow tie with motherly precision. Your guests are waiting, and I believe you two have a cake to cut, properly this time. As they prepared to return to the reception, Eliza picked up the authentic certificate. It's strange, she mused. This piece of paper caused so much chaos, yet the relationship it represents is what actually matters. Richard squeezed her hand, one of many lessons from today. Together, they moved toward the door, the true certificate secure in Eliza's hands, their path forward clearer than when they'd first spoken their vows hours earlier. The return to the reception was met with a mixture of relief and lingering curiosity. From the remaining guests, Eliza and Richard moved through the crowd with practiced smiles, offering a carefully crafted explanation about paperwork complications that had been successfully resolved. Most accepted this at face value, though Mrs. Whitmore, the elderly guest who had earlier referenced the original scandal, watched with knowing eyes as James Peterson stood stiffly at the edge of the gathering. As the evening progressed and the celebration cautiously resumed, Michael slipped away to make a discreet phone call. He returned 20 minutes later, giving Richard and Eliza a subtle nod. The band had just finished a ballad when two men in understated suits entered the garden, making a direct line for Thomas Harrington. They spoke briefly, their expressions serious, before Thomas directed them toward James Peterson. FBI, Michael whispered to his brother. Financial Crimes Division, my college roommate came through. I thought we had an agreement, James hissed as Richard approached, watching the federal agents drawing closer. We do, Richard confirmed calmly. This isn't about you. It's about Whitfield. The $5 million he paid you came from embezzled pension funds. They've been investigating him for months, James paled. You knew? Not until Michael made his call, Richard admitted. But it explains why Whitfield was so desperate to disrupt our family's merger. He needed a distraction from his own legal problems. The agents reached James, displaying badges discreetly. Mr. Peterson, we need to ask you some questions about recent financial transactions with Clarence Whitfield. As they led James away, a small metallic clink caught Richard's attention. A pair of handcuffs had fallen from one agent's pocket onto the stone pathway. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. Margaret approached her daughter, champagne in hand. Is that what I think it is? Justice, Eliza replied simply. Not for the original crimes, those are beyond reach now, but for the ongoing ones. Will he honor our agreement? Margaret asked, watching James being escorted from the property. He has no choice, Eliza explained. The document I drafted specifically covered our family's history. His arrangement with Whitfield is separate, and we made no promises of protection there. Thomas joined them, his expression grim but resolute. Whitfield has apparently been arrested at his home. The authorities have frozen his accounts, including the one he used to pay Peterson. Poetic, Richard observed. The man who spent 40 years profiting from others' secrets is undone by someone else's. The wedding coordinator approached with renewed confidence now that the mysterious crisis appeared resolved. We've reset the cake table, she announced. Whenever you're ready. Richard glanced at Eliza, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded, and they made their way to where the wedding cake stood, somewhat worse for wear after the earlier drama, but still impressive in the evening light. The photographer positioned herself as the guests gathered around. David handed Richard a new cake knife, gleaming silver, unburdened by family history. A wedding gift, he explained, something without complications. As Richard and Eliza positioned the new knife above the cake, Margaret addressed the assembled guests. Before we continue with tradition, I want to thank you all for your patience today. What you witnessed earlier was the resolution of some long-standing family business. The kind that should have been settled long ago, Thomas added, standing beside her with unexpected solidarity. But today marks a new chapter, Margaret continued. Not just for the bride and groom, but for both our families. Grace stepped forward, raising her glass. To Richard and Eliza, may your union be built on honesty and transparency, unlike the generation before you. The guests murmured in confused appreciation, sensing deeper currents but respecting the privacy of whatever had transpired. As Eliza and Richard finally cut into their wedding cake, genuine smiles replacing the tension of the past hours, Rebecca sidled up to Michael. The agents had perfect timing, she observed quietly. Sometimes justice needs a little scheduling assistance, he replied with a small smile, slipping his phone back into his pocket. Across the garden, The FBI agents escorted James Peterson to their unmarked car. The former judge's shoulders slumped in defeat. His decades of careful manipulation finally unraveled by the very families he had sought to control. As midnight approached, the garden took on an ethereal quality beneath strings of twinkling lights. Many guests had departed, leaving only close friends and family to witness what Richard had spontaneously proposed, a renewal of their vows just hours after the original ceremony. Not because the first one wasn't valid, he explained to the gathered circle, but because now we can speak our promises with complete awareness and freedom of choice. The new cake knife rested on a small table between them, a symbol of their fresh beginning. Unlike the ornate family heirloom that had featured in the earlier debacle, this one was modern, sleek, and unburdened by history. Eliza had removed her elaborate veil, her hair now falling naturally around her shoulders. She looked at Richard with clear eyes, the earlier shadows of doubt replaced by a deeper certainty. "When we spoke our vows this morning," she began, addressing the intimate gathering, "we believed we were making a choice that was entirely our own. We've since learned that our paths were influenced in ways we never imagined. Some might see that as a reason to question everything," Richard continued. "But instead, we've found it reaffirms what we already knew, that regardless of how we were brought together, what we built was genuine." Margaret and Thomas stood side by side, their earlier antagonism softened into something resembling solidarity. Grace watched her son with undisguised pride, while Rebecca and Michael flanked their sister protectively. David stepped forward, assuming the role that James Peterson had vacated. "I may not have the legal authority to officiate," he said with a smile, "but I can certainly witness two people recommitting to the truth they've discovered today." Richard took Eliza's hands in his. "I choose you," he said simply, "not because of family expectations or business arrangements, but because over 7 years you've become the person I trust most in this world. Whatever complications brought us together, what we've built is real, and I promise to spend the rest of my life being worthy of the trust you've placed in me." Eliza's eyes glistened in the soft lighting. "I choose you," she echoed, "knowing everything we know now, seeing clearly where we've come from and where we might go. I promise to build something honest and true with you, to face whatever comes with the same clarity and courage we found today." David handed them the new knife. Together, they finally cut into the wedding cake that had waited so patiently through the day's drama. As they shared the first piece, a tradition they reclaimed on their own terms, the remaining guests applauded, most unaware of the full significance of the moment, but sensing its importance nonetheless. Margaret approached her daughter quietly. "It won't be easy," she said, "rebuilding with truth after so many years of secrets." "No," Eliza agreed. "But necessary." Thomas joined them, nodding to Richard. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, the restitution fund, the restructuring, and explanations," Richard added. "To partners, employees, clients, but not tonight," Grace intervened gently. "Tonight is still your wedding night, after all." As the small gathering continued around them, Richard led Eliza to the dance floor one final time. The band had been reduced to a single pianist, playing softly as the evening wound down. "Quite the wedding day," Eliza murmured as they swayed together. "Not exactly what we planned. Better in some ways," Richard replied thoughtfully. "We're starting with our eyes open. No illusions. No more secrets," she agreed. As they danced beneath the garden lights, the weight of decades of manipulation and deception began to lift. The road ahead would be challenging, making amends, rebuilding trust, establishing new foundations for both families, but they would face it together, with a clarity that their parents never had. "To truth," Richard whispered, echoing their private toast from earlier. "And to writing our own story from here," Eliza answered, resting her head on his shoulder as they danced into their future. Complicated, uncertain, but finally and completely their own.